You might have to use the little arrows down at the bottom.
This is the bird of the hour, a large wading bird phylogenetically positioned between the cranes and the rails, and alone in its family, the Aramidae. This is a good pose of its humpback look in flight that sometimes you see from a distance. Before going any further, I wanted to thank all the photographers who contribute excellent shots of the Limpkins to Facebook. Most of the photos in this presentation were borrowed from Facebook over the years, and I wanted to thank the photographers collectively for their skillful work and their willingness to share it. The Limpkin has many curious habits, some of which we'll discuss tonight. These include a diet of large aquatic snails, raucous ear-piercing calling, a wide variety of habitats, a partial seasonal migration, a limitless variety of nesting sites, a mating system that includes serial polyandry, charismatic courtship feeding, and an unusually calm demeanor that allows close approach. And if those traits were not interesting enough, the Limpkin is currently expanding its range at breakneck speed throughout eastern North America, astounding everyone. In a previous talk, I called the Limpkin Florida's favorite bird. Well, maybe not with the general public, at least apparently among ornithologists and bird enthusiasts. I challenge you to think of any other species in Florida with a similar cover girl portfolio as these images show. And even my own Audubon chapter, Appalachia Audubon in Tallahassee. The Limpkin species ranges from Florida through the Caribbean islands, Central America, and South America, as far as Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia. There are 4 named subspecies, and our Florida subspecies is called the speckled Limpkin. The southernmost subspecies ranges from Panama south. This photo is one in the Pantanal of Brazil and illustrates a lack of white marks below the neck. I only point this out because John James Audubon somehow got a hold of one of these for his painting in The Birds of America. His accompanying text discusses the field marks we see in Florida, bright white spots or triangles on the back and wing feather coverts, but the painting itself is clearly, but unexplainably, the brownback subspecies. This is the state Limpkin distribution map from the soon-to-be-published Florida Breeding Bird Atlas 2. The distribution largely coincides with the distribution of the freshwater apple snail in the interior marshes of South Florida, the rivers and abundant lakes of Central Florida, and the spring-fed rivers of North Florida and the Panhandle. The apple snail food source is both the native Florida apple snail and the exotic island apple snail, which is spread throughout the state and now up into the southeastern U.S. My master's thesis in 1981, co-directed by Fran James at FSU and Bruce Means at Tall Timbers Research Station, color-banded 2 spring-run Limpkin populations, which I was able to follow over 2 years, documenting many aspects of their natural history. These are diagrams of mapped color-banded and unbanded individuals from 1979 at Wakulla Springs, grouped by season. I was allowed to go on the river to do the banding, but was only allowed to ride the boat tours to do my surveys, which I did for over 1,000 trips over the years, until the last banded individual disappeared 12 years later. That was orange in the far right territory. The diagram illustrates that birds are very territorial and are rarely seen outside of their territories. Note that all the colors are closely clustered. I also call your attention to the red and blue birds near the middle of the map. Red was the male who held the territory throughout 1979 and longer, and was never once seen outside the territory. Blue was his mate, and she raised 2 broods with him in the spring, then disappeared for the summer, the middle, July, August in the diagram. She subsequently returned in autumn to mate again with Red in early 1980. This and other examples with color-banded individuals at both research sites documented long-term pair bonds for at least some birds, and also suggested a partial seasonal migration of females. I'm betting that the disappearing females and most of the young of the year migrate to the Lake Okeechobee and Everglades region, where large autumn flocks have been noted. Territorial boundaries are defended mostly by the males, although I often saw resident females driving off interloping females, usually as they flew along the river. Boundary disputes occur out on vegetated flats where very ritualistic sulking, chasing, and wind flapping are common. They are posturing mostly, but rarely this can escalate to foot fighting. Boundary disputes more frequently occur on the river or lake edges, where opposing males climb up in the boundary vegetation, sometimes even climb higher and higher in very tall trees, calling all the while. This is what foot fighting looks like, but it is rarely seen between adults. Most of the territorial defense occurs by chasing in flight or by displacement, when the territorial bird will approach as if to land on top of the intruder on its perch. Territorial defense includes high volume and raucous countercalling, for which the Limpkin is well known. Now I have some sonograms, and I had it all set to play you audios, but it was news to me that you can't do audio on Zoom. So if you have Merlin on your phone, I will tell you where to find these calls. So go ahead, if you have your phones and you can call up Merlin, you can listen to them as we talk about them. This is the creow call, which is the creow, and the next call, the cow call, were described in the literature long before me. So I just kept their names. The creow call is a territorial call given on about 2-second intervals while perched or in flight. If you look on Merlin, the second call in their series is the creow call. The rattling, which you see in the lines of the sonogram, can be used to start or end the call. This is the second major call type, and this is the first one in the Merlin series, the cow call. It is given about once per second, mostly by males who have secured a territory, but who are still unpaired. This call is also loud and is well known to anyone who lives on a lake with limpkins, as it is given all day and night during the breeding season, at least until the poor male can convince a female to join him. I have counted more than 70 calls without pause at Wakulla Springs, where the guests used to ask to have their rooms relocated so they could get some sleep. This is a sonogram of the usually unrecognized female call, which sounds very different than either male call type, either of the male call types. While the female call is usually heard by itself, it is most often heard when she is duetting with her mate. This is the sonogram for both the creow on the top and the cow duetting. And if you can see the female sonogram signature, you will be able to find it in the sonograms. And if I could play a duet for you, there's not a duet in the Merlin app. The Limpkin can also winnow, that is, make a purposeful sound with its wings. Do you see that curled up feather at the leading edge of the left wing? The 10th primary is short and club or sickle shaped. This is another closely cropped view. Many times I've watched limpkins flying up and down a river, and sometimes they winnow and sometimes they do not. I have attributed the sound to be helpful in territorial defense, and I've heard it both day and night. If you want to hear a winnow, go to the second Merlin call, which was the Creow call, which was the Creow call. And at the start of that recording, there is a winnow you can hear just before it lands on a bush and starts calling. Let me talk a minute about telling males, females, and young apart. This is what I would call a classic male triangle pattern in the greater secondary coverts. The white triangles on the shaft of the feathers show up large and bright on what looks like a bottom row of feathers. Here there are 2 triangles showing on that row. This is another bird showing 3 long triangles on the greater coverts. Generally speaking, if I see these triangles, I think it is a male. But picture the same bird without those 3 long triangles, and that is what the females generally look like. So I would call this the classic female triangle pattern. And here is another female. I usually use caution in deciding, though, for a couple of reasons. First, I think it is possible that the prominence of the white triangles on the greater coverts may simply be a function of body size. Males are usually larger than females, but during my field work, I determined that the very heaviest mature females were larger than the lightest of the mature males. So that introduces some uncertainty. Also, of course, feathers might be out of place temporarily. But for the most part, I find that this slightly different male-female appearance holds true. This is a male with a juvenile, and you can see that the juvenile white triangles only appear as streaks at this age. Even as the juvenile approaches full size, they are still without bright, distinct triangles, but rather look more streaked. Limpkins are well known for foraging principally on apple snails. Native Florida apple snails are abundant in healthy freshwater ecosystems in much of Florida. Here you see on the lower left a hardened light pink snail egg cluster, also other broken white shells where snails have already hatched, and 2 clusters of peach-colored freshly laid eggs. You can find characteristic piles of empty apple snail shells scattered throughout Limpkin territories. The shells are typically left unbroken because the Limpkin is able to cut off the snail's operculum and then cut the snail's columellar muscle from the inside of the shell and extract the body whole. Limpkins find snails by visual searching and also by blind probing through dense vegetation. They do not hold the snail as this vintage Tallahassee Junior Museum book label claims, but rather simply lay the snail on as firm a surface as they can find nearby to open the snail. I have even seen one open a snail underwater because apparently it was just too far to walk to higher ground. The Limpkin's bill has a slight gap, which is presumably useful in allowing dexterity in the tips. And the tip of the lower mandible is bent slightly to the side and is also curved downward, which is presumably helpful in cutting the snail from its curved shell. The lower tip is flattened and very sharp-edged like a knife from frequent rubbing against the tip of the upper mandible. The Limpkin's second favorite food is the freshwater mussel, which is also common in many freshwater habitats, especially spring runs in North Florida and the Panhandle. They can live certainly on mussels, but I have not seen Limpkins breed in Florida, where the habitat did not also include abundant apple snails. They do hammer a hole into the lip of the mussel shell to reach in and cut the attaching mussel. Limpkins eat other things, mostly smaller species of aquatic snails, and occasionally other aquatic species, and even upland insects or lizards, but these foods are not usual in Florida. Their ability to eat a variety of food makes sense when you recognize that throughout their range into the Caribbean and Central and South America, they are found in a variety of habitats. This limpkin was at 2,600 feet in the mountains of Cuba. Another example of the limpkin's versatility is their choice of nesting sites. In the very center of this photo is a limpkin on its nest at my second study site at Alexander Springs in the Ocala National Forest. This nest was simply an ever-sinking pile of water hyacinth pulled up from the immediate vicinity, held in the river current only by a clump of bulrush. Most commonly, limpkins will build their nests in thick tangles of vines on low shrubs or around cypress knees over or near the water. In the Everglades, they use sawgrass clumps and pond apple bushes. Another limpkin curiosity is that in the many hundreds of hours I've watched them, I have never seen a limpkin flying or walking nesting material back to a nest. Rather, they stand on the nest and stretch in all directions to pull material towards them. In the case of the water hyacinth nest, they will walk away from the nest a short distance, but when they pick up a plant, they only reach their necks around and place it behind them, a little closer to the nest, but they will never carry it back to the nest. In addition to those common nesting locations, I have seen limpkins nest in quite a variety of places. Here is one 40 feet high in a loblolly pine. This is not where you would expect to see a limpkin nest. I've also seen them nest in the boot of a tall sable palm, on the thick limb of a live oak, and in an abandoned osprey nest in a tall bald cypress. Also, do you remember my color-banded bird, Orange, from Ocala Springs? He nested in a large tree cavity in a cypress tree for a few years. The limpkins have a fairly elaborate courtship ritual. They start hanging close together in late winter. The male starts building the nest, and over those 2 weeks or so initiates courtship feeding, where he finds and opens a snail and then feeds it to his mate, as she takes the position that young will later assume for feeding. During that time, they will start hanging even closer together. The female will lay 6 or 7 fairly large eggs when they're mature, but first-year females will often lay just 4 or 5 eggs. Both males and females successfully breed when they're 1 year old, even though they're prone to failure on their very first attempt of the season. 2 clutches per season are not uncommon, and I've even seen 3. Males and females share incubation duties throughout the day, and although the males often take off to chase territorial intruders, so it's really not a 50-50 deal. The females incubate at night exclusively, while the male rests nearby. Many of these details were only discovered because color banding allowed me to know who was who. Hatching is synchronous, or almost so, and the downy young are immediately moved to what has been termed a brooding platform. That is simply a small beat-down place near the water's edge and hidden from view, where the young stay for about 2 weeks. For the first few days, the female broods the downies, while the male, and later both adults, bring snails back to the platform. The downies soon move further away from the platform to join the adults while they forage. But the downies, even when they get older, unexpectedly never jostle for position to be fed. They just stand by politely and patiently, waiting their turn. Downy young are not black, as it is sometimes claimed. Right out of the egg, they can run, swim, and eat. Understandably, their legs are strong long before their wings develop. Check out the disproportionately sized feet, even before all the down is lost. Both adults care for the young. The juveniles dutifully stay close together almost until they are full grown. After about 6 weeks, the young are still fed some, but are also foraging some on their own and are increasingly rebuffed when they beg for food from the parents. At about 10 weeks, they forage on their own, and by 13 to 17 weeks, are usually chased away by their parents, who may be caring for a second brood by that time. There are predation dangers for limpkins. A lucky photographer caught this bobcat stalking a limpkin, and the hunt was successful. Alligators take their toll on careless adults and young, of course, and the downy young are vulnerable to owls, hawks, large bass and turtles, and water snakes. Early in my research, I followed 4 nests, 2 with 6 eggs and 2 with 7 eggs. All 26 eggs hatched, but none of the young survived to adulthood. Even the apple snail eggs are vulnerable. Here, flooding is killing all the inundated eggs. I think the apple snails and subsequently the limpkins disappeared from Wakulla Springs because of a single bad summer of repeated flooding. The apple snail only lives 1 year, so one bad summer of reproduction can be disastrous for the whole population. In South Florida, Burmese pythons prey on everything, including limpkins. Even roadkills can happen, as limpkins and humans often live in the same waterside territories. Hunters, of course, took a heavy toll as Florida was invaded by sportsmen and commercial hunters in the late 1800s. By the 1920s, the limpkin was reported to have been almost extirpated from all accessible locations. The conversion of freshwater wetlands to agriculture and housing also eliminated vast amounts of limpkin habitat in the 1900s. A few other ecosystem-level trends should be mentioned. One is that apple snails and freshwater mussels need good water quality and healthy aquatic vegetation to thrive, and only when they thrive will the limpkins thrive. But in our lifetimes, invasive exotic aquatic plants like this hydrilla have smothered the native plant communities in many spring runs, rivers, and lakes. Also, high nitrates from groundwater pollution have allowed native algae to clog the systems and kill off the plants that need sunlight to photosynthesize. Those plants used to be the food for the apple snails. Clear water spring runs are almost gone in today's Florida. This figure illustrates how nitrates increased at Wakulla Springs from the first sampling in the 1960s to a peak in the 1990s. But this figure illustrates how major improvements in the design and management of the Tallahassee wastewater treatment system within the spring shed has gradually lowered the levels to the present. So we can correct our past mistakes if we put our minds to it. Lastly, I wanted to talk to you about the impacts of the invasive exotic island apple snail on the limpkin. It is a South American apple snail that was introduced into Florida in the mid-1990s. The exotic island apple snail is much larger than the native Florida apple snail, and it lays far more eggs in each clutch. It can thrive in a wider variety of aquatic habitats, including holding ponds, and relatively quickly spread throughout the state. The egg clusters are readily recognizable with a bright pink color, egg size about like a pinhead, and perhaps 1,000 eggs in a single cluster. Contrast that with the native Florida apple snail clutches, whose eggs are pea-sized and number in the dozens. Where the island apple snail becomes established, it often experiences a population boom and reaches such densities that it can literally strip a water body of all its aquatic vegetation. To every boom, there's a bust, and if it were not bad enough to lose all their submerged vegetation, these water bodies are then vulnerable to subsequent algae explosions because natural algae eaters are also gone. But as a result of these high apple snail populations, limpkins, who eat them without hesitation, have also experienced a population boom in Florida. The annual Audubon Christmas bird count in Gainesville, centered in Paynes Prairie, reported limpkin increases from 0 in 2010 and 2 in 2011 to 235 in 217 and 540 in 2018. Statewide, the Christmas count logged 92 Limpkins in 1991 compared to 3,020 in 2017. This photo was taken in 2017 too, but in Myakka River State Park in Sarasota County. This is the second breeding bird atlas map for the Limpkin that will be released in November, and it illustrates many local changes since the first atlas 25 years ago. Each change has its own local story, but I especially see the arrival of Limpkins into many Tallahassee wetlands, see the light blue symbols in Leon County, and the reduction of the Everglades population, the green symbols clustered in South Florida. The latter change has been attributed to die-offs of apple snails due to extended drought and the lack of an invasion of the exotic apple snail that would have provided a substitute food. Not confined to Florida by habitat or climate, the island apple snail has continued its invasion north and west into the southeastern U.S. Because of that new food source, as well as the presumed eruption of Limpkins from their boom in Florida, the last few years have seen unprecedented Limpkin reports from other states. Whereas just a decade ago, Limpkins were largely restricted to Florida, they are now resident in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina, and breeding has been documented in Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina, in the latter state for 3 consecutive years in at least 4 locations. Moreover, eBird records have been submitted in the last few years from 9 of the 12 southeastern states, and also from Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. Well, I think those states were a complete list when I wrote the Limpkins Breeding Bird Atlas 2 account earlier this year. This past Tuesday, I looked up the current eBird distribution map and found this. This is downright remarkable. A rare bird alert for Limpkin high in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee this past Sunday drew comments that said over 30 had been reported this year in Tennessee. Another commenter called 2023 the year of the flamingo and the Limpkin. Well, I have to imagine that the Limpkin is pretty happy with all this newfound notoriety and is certainly jumping for joy to be able to explore so many exciting places. For myself, I'm eagerly awaiting to see whether they settle into these new latitudes and how we should next describe their new species range. Thank you for your interest in the remarkable Limpkin.
That was great.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. If you have questions, you can type them in the chat. We did have one question from Sherry Ann, and I think you kind of went over it, but I'll repeat it. She asked, can Limpkins eat the non-native snail?
Yes, there was they were a little worried because, as you remember, the snail kite, the biologists with the snail kite were worried with whether the snail kite could eat it, and it turns out it could. And the Limpkins never hesitated. They just have no problem extracting it. I was worried whether maybe the chicks, when they were fed larger pieces, they might somehow not be able to handle it. But there's been no reports whatsoever of any trouble with the Limpkins eating the non-native snail. Anybody else? Anybody still there?
Yes, lots of people still here.
Everybody went silent for a while.
Hey, Dana, Susan's computer just died. I think there's a few more questions and a couple of people said, great presentation.
Okay, let me look. Can they survive in northern winter? Typically, birds have trouble in the cold only because of food issues. And so the question is better whether the apple snail, the exotic apple snail, will survive in the northern climes. And there is report from the island apple snail literature that they do survive better in different water body situations, different temperatures, even more saline situations. So I think the story is yet to be told how far north they can survive. But remember that the limpkins are eating other things. So I'm not saying that there are invasive apple snails throughout that the new range of the eBird sightings of the limpkin all the way up into Canada. But there are aquatic snails and there are mussels and there are insects and all the other things that the limpkin is able to eat. So I would think that they would continue to show up places like that, and then in the winter probably migrate back down to where there are more permanent food sources. But that would include some of the southeastern states that now do have established apple snail populations and other mussels and other aquatic snails. There are other aquatic snails that they'll eat too. How do they build nests in trees if they don't get I didn't see the pine tree nest building, but all the time I've seen them, they pick a place that has enough stuff within reach where they can pull it to them. And of course, they got a pretty good reach because they're a pretty big bird. They'll keep 1 foot on the nest and reach as far as they can, and then wrangle that vine or the stick towards them. Do they use older nests of other birds? No, typically not. And I don't even remember ever seeing them reuse their own nests, except I think the osprey nest was just a one-timer, but the cavity, that orange bird nesting in a cavity, he used the cavity again and again. But that wasn't because he was using a nest. I think he was using the site. The site was more important than the nest. The nests are not very sturdy, and so they might not last more than a year as far as being usable. Do they use the nests of other birds? One time that in the osprey nest is all I've seen. So no, they typically would not use, another bird's nest.
I had a question.
Yes.
Is there a behavioral difference between the other subspecies of limpkins to our species?
Well, I'm sure there's some. I would predict there's some, but I have not spent time looking at the other subspecies. Especially if they're in different habitats, you'd expect them to have different behaviors, foraging behaviors, and maybe mating. Some of the birds that living up in the mountain forests, they would just have different needs.
Thank you.
There are, of course, the limpkins are aquatic, do have aquatic habitats in those places too. So my guess is that those would be very similar. I've listened to the calls on Merlin and in the Macaulay Library. And they just sound the same to me.
Very cool. And if anyone else has questions you don't want to type, you can just unmute yourself. I guess not.
I guess not.
You covered it so well.
I
It's
know, that was
amazing.
really cool.
I'm looking. I don't see any questions that weren't answered.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you did a thorough job.
Yeah. Very good.
Right then.
Okay.
So we really appreciate you
Yes,
coming on,
we do.
Dana, and helping us
I'm
understand this very unique bird. And where do you predict one's going to show up next?
Yeah.
No telling, no telling. I was just shocked when I saw that latest map from eBird. I had heard about the sightings in Nova Scotia, and that's really getting up there. You know, because they're migratory. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. One of the things is when the territory male does not have a mate, and he goes through that cow calling, and he does it all night. I always thought that he's doing that at night because that's when the females are moving, and they're migrating up from the south. I think they're migrating from the south. I didn't talk about that a lot either, but when I was studying them, Rob Bennett, who was studying the snail kite way back then, he called me up one day and he said, I'm seeing huge flocks of limpkins down here in the Everglades. And I had never heard of flocks of limpkins. So I went down there and went out with him in his airboat and saw a flock of 100 limpkins move. They looked like a sort of a flock of crows, you know, so that they're loosely gathered, but they're moving together. They go up and they go down. And while we were watching that, there was one resident male limpkin off in the distance calling his typical calling, and the flock was silent as it moved close to that other male. And so I looked at him through my binoculars as best I could. You can't get very close to him in an airboat, but as best I could, I looked at him and I thought they were female and young in the group. So, and I had also read about big groups of limpkins, especially around the southwest edge of Lake Okeechobee. So it convinced me to speculate that that's where the limpkins are going. I knew that the females and young were disappearing, and the females were coming back after a season of absence to the same male in the same territory. So I think you can call it a partial migration. Some of the males disappear, and I don't know if I had a record of the male coming back to the same territory, but it appeared to me that the higher quality territories were more likely to have the male and even females stay year round. But most territories, the female would leave, male would stay year round, defend it year round, and the female would come back. And I thought they were migrating down to the Everglades where there's a good supply of apple snails.
Oh,
Very
that's
interesting.
very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe some of them got turned around and went north.
Well, I remember what I started to say. So what I'm saying is they're strong flyers, and there's nothing to keep them from going up to Nova Scotia.
I think Lake Erie had a lot of those invasive, what was it, the zebra mussels or?
Yeah, I'm not sure they'd eat those because those are pretty deep, I think.
Oh, that's pretty deep.
And they're pretty small too. But the limpkins will eat tiny little snails too. It sometimes amazed me, even a place where there were a lot of apple snails. Sometimes you'd find a pile of shells that were these small little Campyloma snails and other small ones. And I'm saying, why are they wasting their time on this? And I figured that if they hit it, they'll eat it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think at Meat Gardens, if you go by the little river there, you find big piles of freshwater mussel shells.
Yeah.
No, haven't seen any apple snails though in those piles.
Not there.
Well, the limpkin will hang around places with mussels and eat them exclusively for long periods of time. But as I said in the program, I've never seen a breeding site in Florida that didn't have apple snails.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never seen young there either.
No.
So just
No.
adults. So
Yeah. It's true.
all right.
All right. Well,
Very
we really
good.
appreciate your time. This was an excellent program.
Good.
Yeah.
Glad you like it.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the
All right.
recording.
And
Okay, and I'll stop my share, and I guess I'll say goodbye.
Yes,
thank you
bye,
for your
thank
time.
you. Yes, thank
and-
you. That was really fun.
We'll see
fun time.
everybody
Yeah.
here next week.
Yep.